In thinking about this, I guess I've tried to do something which is a combination of both the practical and the self-indulgent. So I'm genuinely talking about something which really inspires me, but I've tried to make it a series of kind of hints and tips about what that might mean for being a planner nowadays, and drawn a link between the two. And I'm talking about this group in particular, although more particularly, I'm talking about a book that was written about them. So there's a book called Revolution in the Head by a guy called Ian MacDonald. And basically what he did in writing that was he linked the way the Beatles worked, all of the songs that they produced, with the social changes that were going on around them at the time in the 60s. If you've not read it, I urge you to read it, because it is probably the best book that has been written about the creative process. And that is the inspiring thing about both that book and about their career, because everything they did tells us something about how creativity works, and tells us something about how we can make creativity work better in our industry. So all the quotes that you see on these charts come from that book, and may whet your appetite to getting it at some point. So the first point about how their time together was inspiring is the way they worked. And the lesson for us is about working together. This was a group of people for whom kind of their relationship with one another produced more creativity than perhaps any four individuals who've worked together in any field up until now. Crucially, they were friends. So they knew each other intimately. They knew the good, the bad. It meant they were able to disagree, fall out, and come back together again. There's this wonderful quote here on the right-hand side when they talk about, so 1965 and the Byrds, Roger McGuinn asking Harrison whether he believed in God. And Harrison replies, well, we don't know about that yet. I sense that at the time they were kind of a collective mind, four individuals working together and somehow learning about the world as they went, but able to lean on one another when the doors closed, when they were in their toughest moments. They were able to kind of look at one another and sort of share that experience. Any individual going through what they went through would probably have gone completely mad, and indeed, as we will see later in the presentation, the four of them went completely mad towards the end as well, for various other reasons. But I think this ability to be able to lean on one another, work together and work in collaboration is a great lesson about how we can work in our roles. The second lesson that you can take from them, which can inspire us in our roles, is about trusting your instinct. And it's the famous story about Paul McCartney coming up with Yesterday, and he woke up one morning with this melody and this tune in his head. He wasn't sure where it had come from. He goes to the studio, he asks all the other members of the band, you know, I've heard this song somewhere, I'm not sure where it comes from, I'm trying to find out. And after a little while, they basically said, well, it doesn't come from anywhere, you've just invented it. And it was that creative process whereby which during his relaxing time, during the time he was sleeping, the brain had done its work. And sometimes, again, we have those ideas in our business where something just comes to you and you don't necessarily feel as though you've worked incredibly hard to get to that point, but it's a moment of inspiration. And what they were able to do and what he was able to do was trust that moment. Not overanalyze it, not overthink it, not worry it to death, but just get to that stage where you go, yeah, that's amazing and it just happened and I'm going to go with it. The third area that really drove them forward and again can inspire us in what we do is their competitive edge. And it's easy to forget, you know, you look at kind of the Beatles' success. At the time, it seemed to be completely effortless. There was a time in the 60s when there was this tremendous flowering of creativity. It's easy to imagine them as artists toiling away in their own world, not really thinking about stuff around them. But crucially, they were in a business. They were in a business where they had to sell records. Their ability to influence people around the world was based on their popularity, and they were intensely competitive. You can see the two quotes here about, you know, their observation of what Dylan did with things like Subterranean Homesick Blues and Like a Rolling Stone, where they look at that and they go, okay, that's not happening somewhere else aside from us, that's happening in our competitive set. We've got to do something about that. We have to raise our game to be better. You know, things like, you know, the famous story about their competition with the Beach Boys, where they heard Pet Sounds and they go, okay, this means we have to work harder. they've just made probably the greatest album of all time. We need to be aware of that competitive set, work even harder. As a result, they made Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and pretty much drove Brian Wilson to reclusiveness. Drove him out of the game, pretty much. And I think, again, the lesson we can take from ourselves is, even though we are in a creative industry, being highly aware of who are the other thinkers around you that are doing the work that you want to do, who are the other agencies, who are the other people that are doing the work that you admire, and really being well informed about that and analysing it effectively can drive you on to further achievements. The next point is about the innovation that they brought. And clearly what they were able to do was to innovate in the content of what they did. So they were creating new forms in which the pop song worked. They were able to constantly be creating new songs, new lyrics, new melodies. But they went so much further than anyone else in their day, because they were interested not just in what was in the song or how the song sounded. They were interested in the way it was constructed, the way in which sound worked, the way in which they could use the studio. A great quote here from the book around the difference between these two Lennon tracks, I Am the Walrus and Revolution, which were only 10 months apart. And yet, they sounded like they came from completely different artists, from completely different bands. But because of all of the creativity they were able to bring to things, they were thinking about innovating in pretty much every area. Again, a lesson which is very close to the way that we work nowadays. It's not just about the content of thinking that we produce, but it's also about the spaces and places that we can deploy it and how we can make that work. And then a really simple thing, which again is easy to forget when you hear things like the story of how yesterday came about, which is so much of what they did when they were at their best was the result of incredibly hard graft. And what they were able to do was that combination of the moments of wonderful inspiration that came to them when the melody comes kind of completely formed into your head. But then they realized that what they had to do if they were to move things forward was then to work for hours and hours and hours in the studio, crafting the way that the song worked, working out how the lyrics would work, working out how they could use the studio to create something brand new. And there's just no substitute for those hours that you put in, those hours that you spend crafting your initial inspiration. And of course, the thing that happens to them quite near the end is they lose so much of that ethic. And what happens towards the end of their period is that they begin to believe that they're great. And they begin to believe that their greatness is something which just happens, that there's not anything that they need to do in terms of putting the hours in. They lose that discipline. You know, as it says, they kind of dismiss the fact that they're so brilliant in their initial phases. But then as they move through towards the end of their career, as you get past kind of 1967 onwards, they're just celebrating the haphazard. They're just sticking stuff out there because it sells anyway, and, you know, random is great and it's all fine. They'd fallen in love with their own myth. And any of us who achieve success in this business need to be constantly reminded that, you know, what you did yesterday is worth nothing if you don't have the great kind of rigor to achieve more tomorrow and to keep on going. I think as I'm getting almost precisely to my 10 minutes, which hopefully will set a precedent for the other speakers. The final thing to remember, and again, it's not a kind of rational piece, but more an instinctive piece, is if you place yourself back into the very early days of the 60s when pop was very well produced, there was clearly a kind of way of doing things, there was a professionalization in studios, there was a feeling that the songwriting teams, you know, down on Denmark Street or wherever had kind of worked out how to have a hit single, the producers had worked out how to do it, the record companies had worked out how to manufacture acts, how to frame them, how to market them. And of course, the most inspiring thing about what they did was that they were able to completely disrupt that with things like this. In thinking about this, I guess I've tried to do something which is a combination of both the practical and the self-indulgent. So I'm genuinely talking about something which really inspires me, but I've tried to make it a series of kind of hints and tips about what that might mean for being a planner nowadays and drawn a link between the two. And I'm talking about this group in particular, although more particularly, I'm talking about a book that was written about them. So there's a book called Revolution in the Head by a guy called Ian MacDonald. And basically what he did